All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack a conflict that absolutely reshaped global politics, literally split a nation right in half, and yet somehow it kind of just slips through the cracks of our historical memory. We're talking about the Korean War. It's a conflict layered with massive geopolitical tension and just unimaginable human drama. And you'll often hear it referred to as the Forgotten War.
To really grasp the gravity of this, I want you to just think about the number 3 for a second. This represents 3 years of absolutely brutal, grinding warfare. In just 36 months, the Korean Peninsula was plunged into a level of destruction that claimed millions of military and civilian lives. The sheer scale of the conflict packed into such a tiny time frame is staggering, and it set off geopolitical ripples that we are quite literally still feeling today.
Now you might be thinking, well, wars usually have a clear beginning, a middle, and a definitive end, right? But the Korean War totally bucks that trend. It created one of the world's most heavily guarded militarized borders, and technically, legally speaking, this war continues to this very day. It's a frozen conflict.
So to see how we got to a frozen conflict, we actually have to rewind a bit to the ashes of another massive war. The year is 1945. World War II has just ended. Japan surrenders, and in doing so, they lose control of Korea after 35 years of really harsh occupation. But the Korean Peninsula isn't simply handed back to its people. Instead, in this frantic post-war scramble, it's divided up by global superpowers. The Soviet Union moves in to occupy the north, while the United States occupies the south.
Which brings us to another really crucial number, 38, the 38th parallel. This latitude line was chosen to slice the peninsula right in half. And what's truly wild about this is just how arbitrary it was. It was chosen super hastily by junior American officers late at night, using literally nothing but a small National Geographic map. It was only meant to be a temporary, administrative thing, just a way to manage the immediate post-war logistics. But as the months ticked by, that totally arbitrary line on a map hardened into a permanent fracture.
What happened was, 2 completely rival governments emerged. In the north, a communist government led by Kim Il-sung took hold. In the south, a democratic government formed under Syngman Rhee. And this wasn't just some local political disagreement. This was the new ideological frontline of the entire world. The global Cold War had officially arrived in Asia.
The tension finally just snaps at dawn on June 25, 1950. Nearly 75,000 North Korean soldiers come pouring across the 38th parallel. It's this sudden, incredibly dramatic downward swing of the pendulum. You've got tanks rolling through mountain roads, infantry surging across rivers. The invasion is swift and completely overwhelming. Within days, the South Korean capital of Seoul is captured. South Korean forces are desperately struggling to hold their ground. In response, the United Nations quickly condemns the attack, and the United States, under President Harry Truman, enters the conflict alongside a UN coalition. The powder keg had officially ignited.
By August of 1950, the situation on the ground was incredibly dire for the South and the UN forces. They had been pushed all the way down to the southeastern tip of the peninsula, boxed into this tiny defensive pocket known as the Pusan Perimeter. For weeks, intense, desperate fighting raged across hills, villages, and muddy river crossings. With their backs literally to the sea, this was a true final stand. If this shrinking perimeter fell, the entire peninsula was lost.
But then, we see this incredible, almost unbelievable shift in momentum. General Douglas MacArthur proposes an incredibly daring, highly risky amphibious operation. Despite these treacherous, extreme tides that could have easily stranded the entire fleet, on September 15, 1950, a massive naval force lands at Inchon, far behind enemy lines. It is an absolute masterstroke that catches the North Korean forces completely off guard. The momentum swings wildly upwards. Within just weeks of those soldiers rushing the beaches, Seoul is liberated and the North Korean army is in full retreat.
So suddenly, the UN forces are advancing rapidly. They're pushing North Korean troops way past the 38th parallel, heading straight for the Yalu River. But here's the massive lingering question. What happens when a Western-led military coalition approaches the border of a newly communist China? Because as those UN troops pushed further north, alarm bells were absolutely ringing in Beijing.
Well, we got our answer in October 1950. In a completely shocking twist, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer soldiers secretly crossed the border into Korea.
They moved silently at night through these snow-covered mountains, and their arrival was often announced only by the sudden haunting sound of bugles piercing the dead of night right before a massive, overwhelming surprise attack against the advancing UN forces. The entire dynamic of the war literally changed overnight.
What follows is just harrowing. The UN forces are suddenly vastly outnumbered, and they're forced into a desperate, grueling retreat. And this wasn't just a military struggle. It was an absolute environmental nightmare. They were fighting through one of the coldest winters recorded in modern warfare. During battles like the infamous frozen Chosin Reservoir, temperatures plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Just imagine that for a second. Silent nighttime troop movements through heavy blizzards, crossing frozen rivers, frost coating every single piece of equipment, and fierce battles raging in sub-zero temperatures. The atmospheric extremes were absolutely devastating.
The absolute chaotic whiplash of just this first year is staggering. From the initial invasion in June, down to the desperate defense at Pusan in August, the daring reversal at Inchon in September, the shocking Chinese entry in October, until finally, in 1951, the front stabilizes. And guess where it stabilizes? Right back near the original 38th parallel. After all that blood, all that movement up and down the peninsula, the pendulum swung back almost exactly to where it had started.
Once that front stabilized, the entire nature of the conflict changed. The rapid movements and sweeping maneuvers were completely replaced by the deep freeze. The war basically devolved into a brutal stalemate of grinding trench warfare. It became a war of endless trench systems, massive artillery bombardments, and devastating, incredibly costly fights over small, seemingly insignificant hills. These were battles that would earn haunting names like Heartbreak Ridge and Porkchop Hill.
And here is where a really tragic irony took hold. While diplomats literally sat down in tents to negotiate peace, a process that dragged on for 2 agonizing years, by the way, the soldiers remained out there in those trenches. Active, deadly fighting continued every single day. The costs in human life just kept rising, while the actual front lines barely moved an inch. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an agreement was reached. The Armistice was signed, ending the active bloodshed and silencing the artillery. But remember what we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer? This was an armistice, a ceasefire agreement. It was not a formal peace treaty. In fact, no peace treaty was ever signed. As part of that armistice, they created the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ. It's this heavily fortified buffer zone slicing right across the peninsula. And here is a totally wild, surprising fact about it. Because humans have been strictly kept out of this heavily mined strip of land for over 70 years, it has ironically become this thriving, virtually untouched nature reserve. Yet, if you turn on the news today, the DMZ is still right there, lined with fences, guard posts, and abandoned bunkers. It is a physical, concrete manifestation of a war left fundamentally unfinished.
So calling it the Forgotten War feels almost like a huge disservice when you consider these facts. It claimed millions upon millions of military and civilian lives. It completely and permanently reshaped global politics. It was the absolute catalyst that strengthened massive military alliances, and it drastically intensified the global Cold War. The consequences of those 3 years are literally woven into the very fabric of today's international relations.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We study history because understanding the past helps us navigate the future. So when we look at a conflict that flared up so quickly, drew in the entire world, and ended without true resolution, what does this forgotten war actually teach us about our own, often fragile, completely unguaranteed peace today? It's a question definitely worth keeping in mind as we look at the world around us right now. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our present. See you next time.